some of you may or may not know, every year Z Prime gives out the ETS Thought Leader of the Year award. Previous year award winner, you're going to hear the 2020, which is Calvin Butler. Here on your left, he's on your right. He won in 2020. And in 2021, Mr. Paul Lau, General Manager of SMUD, won. And the Thought Leader of the Year award is really, we developed it as to identify and recognize leaders who are really pushing the envelope with their staff and their community and championing change and and that's what this conference is all about. So we had another amazing group of finalists, but today I just wanted to announce the winner, which you will hear from tomorrow. And she's pictured on your far right there. And it's the hometown winner. It's Mr. Jackie Sargent, General Manager of Austin Energy, is the 2022 Thought Leader of the Year. And so tomorrow, if you guys are still around, please stick around. We're going to have she'll be around. Some of her family will as well, and have some remarks, and we'll celebrate with her at lunch. If you can make it, it'd be great. But and if you see her tomorrow or on social media, definitely give her a shout out. If you look at what Austin's become over the past 4 years under her leadership, it's amazing. It's amazing to see how she works with her team, how she inspires her team, and she really puts innovation in their team in different ways. And so, congratulations, Jackie. And now I hand it back over to Ricky.
All right, our next panel today is a larger panel, and it's going to be our very exciting panel right before our networking break. Please help me welcome to the stage, Unlocking Fleet Electrification Opportunities, our panel for you this afternoon, or morning, sorry.
Yes. Okay, we cannot see you all, so you can do whatever you want. Good morning. So, I am hoping that this is an exciting panel, and I want to set some context. My name is Navni Trivedi. I am a founder of a company called VRINDA out of New York, and I have dedicated last 8 years working in clean energy transformation. And the reason I'm sitting in the middle will explain to you what I do. So let me set some stage here. We just came from Zoom world, and we were supposed to go to Metaverse. But in between, we decided that we want to meet in person, so I'm very glad that we are here. But in the background, where gamification, you can think about, this is a perfect backdrop to discuss fleet electrification. So we have, not far from here, oil fields pumping oils. We have very near a Tesla factory producing electric cars. We have a war in Russia and Ukraine, rising the energy prices and threatening energy security. And we have rising inflation, which is going to upend everything. And if you think about these four quadrants, the middle thing is still the issue of equity and climate justice. So why I'm saying this in the context of fleet electrification, because recently I worked with Con Edison to develop their strategy for fleet electrification in New York. And we had a lot of time because of COVID. We were sitting at home, so we did a lot of research. And some of the interesting facts came from there, which will provide you the context of and the opportunity of fleet electrification. So as you know, transportation sector is the biggest contributor of greenhouse gases in US. We also know that when it comes to the fleet definition, fleets are 6 vehicles or less on an average. 90% of fleets in America are 6 vehicles or less. But still we talk about FedEx and UPS and Amazon getting electrified, which don't contribute to more than 2-3%. So that is one fact. The second fact is the disproportionate impact of vehicle pollution on disadvantaged communities. So I live in Manhattan, and when we did this study, we looked at the data about pollution, and we plotted on the GIS map, and Manhattan is the most polluted borough of New York among all five boroughs. But when we superimposed poverty on top of it and health, suddenly that dark color of Manhattan disappeared and it went to Bronx and Queens. And it was not a coincidence. So if I was looking at pollution and making my strategy, I should be helping Manhattan because we have most pollution. But when you look at poverty and pollution and health impact, you suddenly realize that fleet is impacting disproportionately poor people. In fact, most of the kids who are suffering from asthma are 5 to 11-year-old, and then they live in Bronx. And you all know this thing that warehouses are not built in Manhattan, right? So invariably, when we talk about fleet electrification, it's about real people and their lives. So this panel, really, I have fantastic people on stage. And by design, I have made them sit. So my left side is the utilities, which are the bottlenecks, which you will learn. As it is perceived, we will know at the end of this session whether they are not or they are. On my right side is a combination of policymakers or policy advocates, as well as the industry, which is trying to make this transition. So in this panel, we are going to have real perspectives from real people who are kind of working on this and very passionately. So also, as you can see, this panel is also a representation of women in energy, because that's around 20%. So we have Erika on my right. So I would like to begin with Erika, and what I want all of you in the panel to share, with this background which I laid out, what's your perspective? Erika, especially looking at the policy side and goals and like how to achieve that. And then, we go from there. Greg, you pick up and then.
Oh, thank you. I guess I got the dead mic. So thank you all so much for having me here today. I'm the Director of Global eMobility for the World Resources Institute. We are an international think tank with 1,500 staff all over the globe. I personally operate in every continent except Australia. So I work in all time zones, and I have had the fortunate experience to see from a high level what the transition looks like for electric vehicles in every kind of country. And we are all facing the same problems. What we're talking about here in the US applies to my colleagues in Brazil or Colombia or Africa, China, Indonesia. They're all experiencing the same problem. So I feel like as a global brain trust, we can absolutely overcome the fleet electrification dilemma. Why is this really critical that we focus on fleets? Number one is climate. We have less than 10 years at this point to have our global climate emissions if we want to stay at 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're already at 1.1 degrees, and we are seeing catastrophic impacts all over the globe. So just imagine at 4.4 more, it's going to be even worse. But if we don't have our emissions, it's going to be the worst possible outcome we could imagine for our entire globe. The IPCC report that just got released 2 weeks ago said we are in a climate emergency, all hands on deck. And right now, implementation is paramount. We have a really unique opportunity with transportation electrification. It comprises 25% of our global emissions. If we can reduce that alone, that could make a huge difference in the trajectory. And fortunately, we have the technology now to do it. We have seen a doubling of our transportation emissions in the last 30 years. It will double again in 2100 if we do not even with the current commitments. So we still have a long way to go. We have, in terms of the amount of investment, the amount of chargers that we need on the road, the amount of vehicles we need on the road, according to WRI's State of Climate Action Report, we need a 22x increase in electric vehicles by 2030 and a 28x increase of electric vehicles by 2050. We have a lot of charging infrastructure to meet that demand. We are estimating 300 million chargers are needed all over the world at an investment of about 600 billion. So where is the money coming from? Where are the chargers coming from? How quickly can we integrate them and interconnect them to the grid? We have got to reduce the bottlenecks to make this happen in a very short amount of time. And so I'm imploring you all as the utility industry to make this your number one priority. We have lots of priorities in the world, but transportation electrification should be among your most important and significant to deal with now. I'll wrap it up too with a couple of points of why we're starting to see such a push for fleet electrification. Number one is, for those who aren't familiar with the GHG protocol, 9 out of 10 Fortune 500 companies currently use that as their GHG inventory reporting mechanism. Scope 1 emissions, which are their direct impact, that means their own fleets, are a big push for electrification because it's one of the easier solutions to abate their own emissions. We're also starting to see a lot of Fortune 500 companies pushing down these requirements as part of their Scope 3 emissions reduction strategies to their suppliers. So you'll probably start getting a lot of calls from these suppliers saying, how can I electrify? Because my big client is asking me to do this. So we're gonna start to see a lot more of these. We've seen major international commitments by companies to go 100% electric in their fleet. 120 have signed commitments through EV100, and we are seeing more. So this isn't a trend that's going to go away. I think the biggest issue right now is just infrastructure, honestly.
Okay, Gary, so as you know, we have policy, we have money running from federal government, we have technology, and you are the developer. So why don't we just put it? Tell us what's holding back.
Sure, so let me just build a little bit on what Erika just said. So when we look at the energy transition, a couple of profound changes. One, today our grid is about 40% carbon free in terms of the generation, and we have goals to make that 100% carbon free, which means addressing 60% of our current generation, either replacing it or cleaning it up if we're going to meet our carbon reduction goals. And then we also see electrification. Between now and 2050, we're going to see a doubling in the amount of electricity which is consumed by our grid here in North America. Not quite doubling, but a major part of that is going to be electrification of transportation. It's one of the more significant components of growth. So when you think about this, 60% of our generation today needs to be addressed, plus we're going to double the amount of generation we need between now and 2050. So these are profound changes for the industry in terms of generation capacity, but also the grid to be able to deliver that energy. So I think there's a couple of things that are going on with electrification. One is with fleet electrification, we're seeing impact to the grid. We did a study where if you get clustering of fleet depots, you can easily exceed the capacity of substations and circuits. So there's going to need to be investment, and utility commissions and utilities need to be looking at the make-ready requirements of fleets and how they get integrated into the grid. Basically, it's a commercial and industrial spot load, but if you do get clustering, you can have significant impact to the grid operations. We're seeing the implementation of EV charging infrastructure, and that can vary depending upon whether it's fleet consisting of last mile vehicles, medium and heavy duty trucks, distribution, maybe it's a Class 8 truck or I guess a heavier vehicle. We're still seeing some delays in electrification being applied to long-haul freight electrification, but then we're also looking at rail and transit in terms of electrification of transportation. And the EV charging infrastructure will vary depending upon what the needs and requirements are. And we need to address, if it's a fleet and a depot, we need to address where. We need to look at how much energy is going to be required. We need to look at what's the dwell time or duration and determine the requirements of the charging infrastructure, and then that in turn will impact the grid. I think one thing that people overlook is there's a digital component to EV charging infrastructure, how you manage state of charge, how you do local energy optimization behind the meter, and then how you also are optimizing the grid performance. There's also scheduling, there's telematics, there's maintenance, there's driver scheduling, and also this EV charging piece. So I think that's a key component. It's not just the moving the electricity and being able to put electrons into a vehicle battery, but it's also how you manage those processes and the grid integration. And then finally, fleets, they're a business. It's total cost of ownership. It's a spreadsheet calculation, and if the number in the lower right-hand corner is black, then companies are going to move forward to electrify. But the key issues are, what are the availability of the vehicles? Are the dealership infrastructure in place? Can you get vehicles? And this is going to be particularly important for the smaller fleet operators. And then, going forward, the service capabilities. Can the grid make ready be completed in the amount of time that it's going to take to get the vehicles? Sometimes, the equipment like transformers could be part of the bottleneck, although we're working on that. But there's equipment which needs to be implemented in order to support the vehicles, and then there's also lead time associated with vehicles. But it's a total cost of ownership for fleets, and there's a lot of benefits: lower fuel costs, lower maintenance costs, and I think we're going to see the transition occur fairly quickly once the vehicles are more readily available.
So, Drew, you heard it, right? Fleets are C&I customers. So what's your problem as a utility? Why not just build everything quickly?
First of all, I want everyone to notice the first thing I did was share my mic, right? So from utilities perspective, right? This is a point that was made yesterday, actually. I asked a question remotely, and I asked, what's one thing you believe that you don't yesterday to an executive from Berkshire Hathaway? And the reason why I asked that is because a lot of these things that are happening are coming from basically the unknown, right? It's kind of the unexplored world. And the thing I want to take away from this is, that everyone to take away is that it's over. The transition is happening. I'm going to ask for hands. Who owns an electric vehicle in this room? That's pretty good, but it's not even close to half. Now, how many people in here believe that it's still undecided whether or not all cars will be electric, fairly soon? Who believes that? It's like one person. And that's the problem, because I can guarantee you all OEMs, the CEOs, they've made their decisions, 100% of them. It's over. And I'll start with that. And the second thing I'll say is that transportation electrification is the greatest pivot that this country will make since the railroads. It's going to be huge. And going back to that whole sharing thing, one thing you'll notice about utilities is we offer access to every possible customer everywhere. If you build a shack out somewhere, we'll build you service there. And by that, there will be some way to charge. Now, how does this impact fleets, right? Well, fleets, they're companies, they have an ESG, an environmental, social, governance strategy that they abide by, but at the end of the day, it's not just about virtue signaling, it's about economics, right? The numbers have to matter. And when you look at the numbers for fleets, you look at the top three costs: fuel, depreciation, and maintenance. And EVs take care of all three of those. And then when you get into kind of the more regional or even hyper-local instances of issues with fleets, especially driving costs right now, and I'm by no means a fleet expert, but I did sleep in a Holiday Inn. If you look at what impacts fleets right now, the number one thing is the lifespan of vehicles are being expanded because they can't get new vehicles, right? That's number one. And so they have PM problems, and they have to change their PM schedules. The next biggest thing that they're being impacted by is crazy fuel fluctuations. They don't care really if fuel is overly expensive or cheap. They just needed to be consistent. And I just went through a rate case, and let me tell you something. That's nothing you want to do a lot, right? And so you can count on rates from utilities to be relatively stable year over year, which is beneficial to fleets. You look at, one of the other biggest problems is workers, basically labor, right? Which goes along with maintenance. And the beauty of EVs, trucks have, and you're going to love this number, 4% of the maintenance cost of non-EVs.
Wow.
Yeah, it's dangerous. So when you look at the kind of break-even point for EV trucks, when I'm talking, I'll use two examples: Bright Drop, which is GM's new EV, and the Ford E-Transit. The break-even time is between 1.2 and 2 years. That's at that point you're making money, right, over getting an internal combustion engine. The lifespan of those vehicles is expanded to 10 years. So you basically have a run rate of at least 8 years of where you're going to be doing substantially better owning an EV fleet vehicle versus a non-EV fleet vehicle. That's right now. That's not 2 years, 3 years from the future. I can guarantee you when you talk to fleet managers, they would want to switch. It's like you said, it's the black number at the bottom, right? And there's conversations that have to be had, and Karl and I are probably being bothered too much about running scenarios and things like that. But at the end of the day, the OEMs are oversubscribed. They can't produce these things fast enough, and that's the only thing that's really slowing down the transition. And so I'm going to turn over to Karl, but I want to leave another number for everyone in here, right? When you look at utilities and basically what's important to us, fleets make up 1 out of every 5 vehicles, right? And we know that by 2032, we're going to have 24% of our load that's going to be coming. Actually, it's 24 additional percent of load is coming from EVs. That's going to be the tune from just the fleets alone, somewhere between 80 and $100 million. It's a number everybody can get behind. That's a rate increase. That's an opportunity of not going to our customers and asking for more money. And finally, and this is pretty big. With fleets comes a different relationship, right? So our customers started at ratepayers. We now call them customers. They're transitioning to partners, where they're going to partner with us to shape load. They're going to come on and off when we want them to. They don't care as long as they can run their vehicles. The average fleet vehicle, what do we call it? The Walmart delivery vehicles, we call it the last mile, 60 miles a day. They can do that all day. They don't even have to recharge all the way. They're going to be a partner. And so, with that, the opportunities are vast. We just have to seize them. And I can guarantee you, we're not going to be the bottlenecks. So it's on you guys.
Okay, so as you know, Andrew didn't say that he used to work at GM, so he conveniently bailed out from utility. So now, Karl, you are the utility guy.
Yeah, who here is visiting from out of town? Can I get a show of hands? All our visitors. All right, and who here is local? Can I see your hands? Now, mathematically, that should be 100% of hand raising. So if you didn't raise your hand, you're not participating. What I would encourage you is look at the other raise hand groups and introduce yourselves. So I'm Karl with Austin Energy. So I'm your host utility. Welcome to Austin. We are very excited to have ETS back in person, if you will. And so Austin Energy, we are the 3rd largest city-owned electric utility in the U.S. We've been in business since 1895. So that skews our perspective, how we look at things. We look very strategically. We have very long-term mindset and relationships with our customers, and that also impacts our thinking. One other little kind of fun fact is, how's the air conditioning in this room? Pretty cool, right?
It's very cold.
I think the air conditioning in downtown buildings is just a little cool and a little crisp. And why that is, majority of these downtown buildings are on our chilled loop system. So you're breathing in ice that's froze at night when rates are very low and we potentially have an overcapacity in wind. And then it's melted like a Alaska sea breeze during the day into your lungs now. So enjoy the cool air. On transportation electrification, one thing where I talk to utilities about is, so this is a drill down in one of our 5 pillars. I really encourage the folks here to think holistically about transportation electrification. And as an electric utility, what we found is your lane is as wide as you want it to be. You really are, as a community partner, there is a lot of vacuums out there. So today, one of the 5 pillars is fleet mobility, to include new mobility as a service, gig economy drivers. All that falls under our fleet portfolio. Infrastructure is a pillar. A lot of electric utilities really like to focus, and I heard a comment, we need more infrastructure, and that's definitely true. But infrastructure in and of itself doesn't get where we need to go. We have 1,300 public charging ports and growing, unlimited fueling for $4.17 a month. So we also want to keep fueling simple and people how they can understand. Also, if you don't have a strategy in equity and inclusion in all these programs, we have it as a separate pillar, but it's a foundation to everything we do. You're also in your boat. So I also didn't know how to answer the question earlier about, who owns an electric vehicle. I don't own a vehicle. I have an electric bike, but I don't know how to raise my hand. But I also just think it's just how when we talk to all our communities, I also think we can't think in terms of number of EV units. It's really about transportation electrification and mobility and what works for a lot of folks, and not just pigeonhole, units rolling off the floor necessarily. And I'm not saying that was the intention, but it is part of the thought process as we move forward. 4th is outreach. If you don't have an outreach or education strategy, you're missing the boat. You're not able to, rise your other areas. So we have a program called EVs for Schools, which is 6th grade through 12, 3 different tiers, very popular, launched in 4 Title I schools. Title I means a high percentage of kids come from low-income families. It's now in 132 schools in Central Texas and growing every day. You may or may not see our beloved partner, Stevie, the EV-loving T-Rex, in and about. So Stevie is a social media bit of an icon here in Austin. Stevie's videos get over 1 million views, mostly regional here. And it also just kind of sets the tone, and it just gives you a brand. And then the 5th pillar being grid integration. How are we going to, incorporate all these assets? So we've done every V1X, V2X, demand response, time of use, off-peak. We've done a lot, and so we have a lot of data in that field and grid integration work. But it's also kind of of the 5 pillars. And I'll just end on this. One is, I get to work with Drew all the time, and this isn't stage Drew. This is how he is all the time. He is truly that passionate.
I'm sorry about that.
No, and I love it. And what I found in utilities, although, we get the bottleneck thing, and there is, all jibes, maybe have a baseline of truth. But when I work with Drew and my team, who you'll see around here, is they are really pushing it hard. And I don't know of a more passionate ecosystem. And then the last thing I'll end in is impact. So Austin recently updated our climate and equity plan to 2030. And so one of the pillars in the climate equity plan is transportation electrification. So our goal is 40% of all vehicle miles traveled by 2030 will be on the electric platform. So one is, I just want to, once again, that metric's important. When we first convened the working group, it was, well, how many EVs we need? And I've seen other plans do that, 1,000 EVs, 50,000 EVs. VMT allows you to reduce and overall, encourage other modes of mobility, and at the same time, you're not pegging units. So our goal is 40%. So the argument isn't if we're gonna hit 40%, is truly can we accelerate it to get to that by 2030? But what does that mean to the utility? One, that number for the utility is $345 million of new revenue per year. It would reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the entire city, our community, by 18%. You're also bringing traditional utility values, especially to low to moderate income communities, where transportation is typical household's second biggest expense. First is housing. For LMI communities, it's 30%. So now utilities are able to bring affordability, reliability, and consistency with their values of being a utility service. And instead of competing in that 2 to 3% pocketbook space, you're now competing and helping manage households 30%. So I would encourage you, do something, start somewhere, keep pushing, don't overanalyze. At some point, you got to get some pilots in the field and get some programs out there and work with your customers.
So, great. I'm a truck owner and I don't care about what you guys talk, because what matters to me is the bottom line. And I guess what I want to now pivot and talk, as Gary, you kind of alluded to, and Karl, that bottom line. So some of my work in New York is to help small fleets electrify, and we ran the numbers and we created the model. And that's where the interesting part comes in, because for most part, the business case is coming along, it's close, but it's not universal. So while people understand that once I have vehicle, my maintenance costs will go down and everything, the challenge of getting to the electric is huge. And unless we solve that, we will not be able to achieve these targets. So in that context, I will again start with Erika. What are some of the policy and incentives which are there and you think should be there, and how they can be channelized to bridge this gap? So just for the perspective in this room, this side is the cost. We are trying to build the value stack so that we can pay for this thing. And I want each of you to kind of help fill up that value stack so that we can, in the end, say that this is bigger than the cost. Erika.
Yeah, I think this is the magic question, is how do we make the numbers pencil, and how do we make a compelling case to the end users to rapidly convert? And we are very close to that delta, that inflection point with the battery prices and all these great new chemistries coming out that I think are really going to decrease the price of the batteries themselves. I think that we have to think about, from the user perspective, ease of integration. These fleet managers are trying something new. That means risk, that means change. And this is something that they've never trained their staff to maintain or drive. There's a lot of hurdles. I've only ever worked with XYZ fuel contractor. Now I have to work more closely with my utility. How do I even figure out what these different rates are? I don't understand this. This is like, rocket science, and I don't understand. So it's easier for me to just stay with what I have. So I think we have to make this not just pencil. It's got to be easy. You got to have programs where you have experts who are willing to go to the customers and say, here's what your cost is going to be to do this project. And here's where we suggest you put the chargers, and we think you should do these kinds of chargers to reduce your costs. We think if you did some behind the meter storage, maybe you could reduce your demand charge by half. We think if you got on this rate tariff, we think you could save this much money. It's got to be simple. And I think that's where we're kind of lacking, I think, as an industry, in making this switch easy as possible for fleets. And the thing is, it doesn't have to be hard. I've been seeing some utilities do some great things with online calculators for light-duty passenger vehicles. Can we do the same thing for fleets? And I think that there's just ways we can hack this so that we can actually do this at scale. But when utilities say, what can we do, Erika? I'm like, you got to hire more people. Like, that's like the bottom line, is bring more bodies to the table to help support your key accounts and in your commercial customers, and help them see, when would be a strategic time to switch, what kind of duty cycles should you switch first, where, the vehicles they have on their lot, which ones are they going to probably sell first and trade out. Those kinds of things, it takes a little bit of hand-holding while people are getting used to the technology. And there's so many options. I mean, as an EV industry, we're making this super difficult with using standards to describe the charger connector, like CCS and 1778, like what the heck? Like, people don't know that kind of stuff, right? So we need to make all this stuff easy and accessible. And so we're getting there, but I think for me, that is probably the bigger pain point. I think people see the value, they see the maintenance savings, they talk to people, they're like, oh, this technology is cool, my drivers would like this. So I think it's not just TCO. It's not just total cost of ownership. It's way more than that. It's fundamentally different.
Yes. Gary, so how, there's still the gap remain, right? Like in terms of the cost and the value, so how, in your view as a developer?
So I think I want to build a little bit on what Erika said, but first, Drew made a comment in terms of cost recovery when you do purchase an electric vehicle. And I think the utilization factor of fleets is really a key driver in terms of driving down total cost of ownership, because you're using the fleet for far more miles than, say, a personal light-duty vehicle, and that really helps the business case and total cost of ownership. I think there's some drivers that can help adoption. One of the things that we're looking at, for example, is a lot of trucks are purchased through financing. And can you finance the EV charging infrastructure as well as the vehicle in terms of helping businesses manage their cash and how they operate their fleets? And so packaging EV charging infrastructure in the financing part of the transaction with the vehicles, I think can also help business owners acquire the vehicles and the infrastructure, particularly the smaller vehicles. I do think there's challenges with the utilities, so I'll challenge my colleagues here to the left. One is making sure that the grid has adequate capability to feed the new loads that are coming onto the grid, and what is the lead time associated with that? And then how is the grid addressing the make-ready requirements for fleet electrification, and what's the policy behind that in terms of state legislators and utility commissions allowing cost recovery for the make-ready for fleets? And, you know, if you have a cluster of fleets, is it the first fleet might be able to connect without a whole lot of cost, but the fourth fleet is going to be paying a whole lot more money, and that's not very equitable. And so how do we address managing clusters on circuits and providing the infrastructure proactively so that, you know, we can have the grid ready to accommodate the fleet electrification? So I think those are some of the challenges, but managing the energy at the site, the depot, you know, what other loads might be at the site, as well as the charging infrastructure. Does it make sense to put in a battery to manage peak demand or not? What are the economics? Do you charge in parallel? Do you charge in series? How do you manage that charging infrastructure in order to be able to deliver the kilowatt hours needed given the dwell time that you do have for your vehicle? So there's a lot of understanding of the vehicle, the energy requirements, how you address those energy requirements, the charging infrastructure, managing the process of scheduling the vehicles and charging, managing state of charge. All of these things are new to fleet owners. And I'll go back to the utilities. There's also one other challenge. If you're charging your vehicles up overnight so they're going to be ready the next morning, you really need to have reliable power, because if there's a disruption and you can't charge your fleet, your business is not going to perform the next day. So reliability is going to be critical for EV charging infrastructure, and that'll be a partnership between the fleet owners and also the utilities to make sure that we're addressing those requirements.
So Drew, as you saw, like, you know, everybody wants lower cost. And part of that is utilities should do more, right? We are already doing, like in New York, I'm not sure about CPS, but like make ready, you know, charger rebates and so forth. But still, people find it's not cutting, you know, to make the business case pan out. So what more utilities can do in terms of the value in your view and in anything you're working on? And Karl, I want to kind of, you know, people are looking for help, actually.
Well, so like Karl's already got it solved, so let's not even start there. He's got this thing nailed. But it starts with what Erika said, which is staff up, right? So as utilities, you got to have people to talk to people. It's a tough thing to do because utilities, especially public utilities aren't good at making future investments, right? It's all about cost recovery, cost recovery, cost recovery. Well, sometimes you got to look out 5, 10 years and you got to say, listen, we're going to get this money back, but we got to make the right investments. It's especially crucial now as we transition away from a Tesla world. I don't know, Tesla was 79% of the market last year. This year it's 69%. That's going to continue to kind of dovetail that way, and we have to make sure the infrastructure is in place. But in terms of fleet, you just gotta do what Karl said. You gotta pilot. You gotta try new things. You gotta get it out there. And some of it's confusing, right? You mentioned J1772. I was gonna get that tattooed on my shoulder, but I'm not now. So, the standards for nerds are great. I love the standards, right? I love talking about, level 1, level 2. There really isn't a level 3, but I'm saying it's level 3, whatever. I like talking about, how many 350 kilowatt hour chargers, but to your point, no one other than me and Karl care about that stuff. No one. And the truth of the matter is they want their vehicles to be charged up and they want to go to work. And so what we have to do is we have to work with the fleet providers. We have to have that touch point. And we have a great team at CPS Energy. I'm going to brag. Clayton Cruzy someplace in here. He talks to our customers. He lets them know, gives them lead time. But right now, in San Antonio and Austin, we have a significant amount of growth to get new service. You're looking at 6 to 9 months. That's the standard. Unless you're an Amazon or someone like that, then we may have some cases because of just the infrastructure build out. But for the most part, it's a long-term deal. And what we found is, especially small businesses, which are very nimble, 6 months of planning, there's a lot of change in 6 months, especially in a post-pandemic / Winter Storm Uri world where they're changing their business model on the fly in order to stay in business, right? So that's kind of the difficulty, and the solution for that, or the opportunity, is to work closely with them. Don't tell them to buy 12 vehicles. They can't anyway, right? So they're just going to get frustrated. Get them 4, get them up on a charger, maybe 1 charger, maybe 2, and give them the right software, help them level the load so they avoid demand charges and they're not upset. And you just got to work with them. It's going to work out. It's baby steps. We're the experts as the utilities, and we can provide that help. And that's the way you do it. Like I said, we went from ratepayer to customer to partner, and it has to be that way.
So, Karl, before you react, I think I want to bring up again the point. So what Drew kind of described, these steps really help, helping them understand what is the right amount of vehicle fleet you need, how much right amount of charger you need, because you can be adding a lot of cost initially, but still, if the bucket is not full, so they are looking to utilities. And I want to kind of prompt you by saying that some of the discussions about vehicle to grid, like can utilities pay them for the service and all, it can be in the business case. So I want you to kind of talk about that, like how we can help more.
Sure. I would say when approaching a partner, rather than having all these ideas, you have to ask them questions of where they are at. I have had starter meetings with fleet managers where they're all in. They might have a larger mandate and how we can accelerate our fleet electrification. I've also had a meeting with a fleet manager literally said, you can't take one of those electric cars on a gravel road because it will jangle apart. And so then that's your approach, and that's your baseline. So one is you might want to prioritize maybe the people already further along and get your lessons learned there, or you need to now start a different approach is, no, you can take an electric vehicle onto a gravel road and it won't jangle apart. Fleets generally do think in total cost of ownership. Consumers think sticker price for the most part, with a major exception. We have now are spiking into nationally over $4 a gallon per gas. So now we're having, that is an important tipping point. That's AAA did a survey that at $4, that was the number where the majority of respondents said, I will do something different than my internal combustion car at $4. So we've already hit that. So we have seen a flood of new interest. So regarding fleets, one, there's a myth. There is a myth that you got to choose between having a green fleet or saving your organization money. I'm going to say that's a myth. So we have 255 EVs in our city fleet right now. That's phase one is 331. So we're at 255 of 331. Those 331 EVs are on track to save the city $3.5 million over 10 years. It's roughly 10,000 an EV in TCO, 10-year fleet savings. And that includes the infrastructure required. And why is that? It's almost half off from the fleet perspective of both maintenance and fuel, how the numbers. And when they actually bought the vehicles on a fleet buy board, specifically there was a lot of bolts that were purchased in that round, it was the same or a little less than the equivalent gas vehicle that was on the fleet buy board. So there's this whole myth. But I would even push even farther. Our fleet services officer, Jennifer, who is awesome. She's not jingle jangle lady, by the way. She is the type that's, I'm all in on how we're going to figure it out. She made an argument, and I'm kind of agreeing with it. And here's her argument. So as a city or as a utility, we get wrapped up in internally what we're doing or city hall or whatnot. But her argument is this: there is nothing more visible to your citizens, to your community, than the type of vehicles you filled. So whether it's the garbage truck that picks up residential trash, the police vehicle that goes by, the fire, whatever, your most visible billboard of what your values are and who is your city could arguably be how your fleet is presented. And so there is such bigger goals. You can save money, you can have that leadership position. The other thing we learned in working with Cap Metro, our local transit authority, their CEOs made a claim: Cap Metro will never buy a fossil fuel bus again. They are out of the fossil fuel bus market. So what does that mean? So there are 12 electric buses now. They just got approval from the board to order another 197. So that will get them a little bit over 50% of their actual bus fleet electrified with that order and existing. So they did build a 200 electric bus depot in North Austin. But how local transit works, they're already looking one for East Austin and other areas because you don't want deadhead miles. That's miles where the bus is just traveling with not people. And they're also looking at in-route charging as well. The best practice we also learned, I'll just end on two best practices and then wrap up, is one is the infrastructure should be staged. So how we're keeping that as affordable. We're not building the 200 e-bus day one. We're doing it in 40 e-bus blocks. A 40 e-bus block for these type of buses, about 5 megawatts. So we're doing it on blocks. And they do expect to save tens of millions of dollars in their fleet cost every year. And the last thing is we do have a tariff for fleet, which the cost isn't energy. Our energy charge is 0.00. It's just a small flat rate. It's about, because what utilities don't want you to do is just rely on spiked charging overnight and whenever, and the less the time you've abandoned that. So how we're addressing that is a pilot tariff where the energy charge is 0.00 to further encourage efficient charging.
So Karl kind of touch upon the last point for this panel was about the myth. So I will go to you, Drew, now. What is the myth about when it comes to electrification of fleets, which people have in the industry and you think is not true?
Well, I don't want to call it a myth, right? It's the unknown. Fleet managers, I'm going to put myself back in that role, like consistency, they like predictability. And the problem is there's not a substantial amount of data. And by substantial, I mean 30 or 40 years, right? So we talked to Ed Pepper from General Motors and Fleets. They have a good 5 years of data, but, that may not give them the predictability they want. But that being said, GM, Ford, they'll stand behind their vehicles. And so, when you look at partnerships, you can kind of confront that myth and you can give them some security. And I want to add one more point as I turn over the microphone, and this is for everyone who works for utilities and the municipalities, and this is for total electrification. I'm going to make this at every time I get a chance to speak. When you refuel an internal combustion engine, for every $1 you spend on fuel, about maybe 1.5 cents stays in the local community. The rest of it goes back to the oil companies, wherever they are, unless you live in Houston, and then it's like, you keep a little bit more. But for every $1 you spend on fueling an electric vehicle, anywhere from 72 to 76 cents stays in the local community. It pays for utilities, it goes back to the city. That's an important number. And that means that theoretically the utilities can help those fleets out a little bit more because we know that return on investment staying in the community.
So we have a little less time, but 30 seconds, what is the myth people think in the industry in your view, Erika, and then Gary?
Well, I think there's a lot of myths, and we all have to work collectively to dispel them. I think there's myths around battery fires. There's myths around the sustainability of battery manufacturing and mining. There's lots of these myths that people don't understand. We are actively addressing all of these things. We will make sure that the supply chain is as clean as possible, as safe as possible. But I would say, as a final note, thinking about what fleets are the biggest priority maybe for every single utility here, school buses. There's $5 billion of money coming from the EPA over the next 5 years to help electrify every single school bus in the U.S. And we have a good chance right from now to help support school bus electrification, learning as utilities as well as the community how to do this correctly and how to do this well. And so I would strongly recommend you engage with your school districts to help support them in getting these funds and being successful.
Gary?
So I know we're short on time. I just want to make one final point, which is I do think policy matters. My office sits on the NC State campus in North Carolina, and we see these diesel buses go by our building each day for the students moving between the different parts of the campus. And so we started asking questions about why can't we electrify those? We'd love to provide high-power charging infrastructure to make that happen. But diving into the policy, I didn't realize there's a climate change senior advisor who is part of the North Carolina Department of Transportation. And she's doing things like responding to the NEVI allocation for EV charging infrastructure along alternate fuel corridors. And there's $7.5 billion over 5 years that's going to be allocated to that charging infrastructure. So I think we're seeing the initiative and the push on the policy side, which is encouraging. The utilities are gearing up to enable electrification. The manufacturers are trying to get the vehicles produced and get those launched. Vendors like ourselves are providing EV charging infrastructure, and I think all the stakeholders are coming together. But I just wanted to emphasize policy does matter, and I think we are seeing policy shifts both at the federal level as well as at the state levels, trying to work to enable broader electrification and accelerate that process. So I think it's pretty exciting.
Okay, so I started with this, so I am going to close this. So biggest myth I think you guys must have learned that utilities are not the same old utilities. They have changed. These are the phases of the utilities. These are the transformation, right? And there is a reason, like CPS hired Drew from GM. Karl is a leading, I keep following him every time. So this is new thing. So there's a myth in the room or in the industry that utilities are not they are much ahead. They are ready for change. The second thing which I have seen working with the fleets, the biggest myth is that really they care about electrification. What I mean by that is they really need a vehicle to do their work, and they want all of us to figure out solving the problem. If you go and tell them that you need to get a vehicle, you need to figure out charging, financing, it's not happening. So the myth here is that people think that customers are really thinking about EV. I talked to a lot of people, their biggest concern was COVID and how to survive their business coming out of the COVID. They were not thinking about electric vehicles. And so as an industry, if we really want to make this kind of move, we need to make it as simple for the end customer as possible. And business models do matter. I think utilities need to do more. Vehicle to grid, paying for the services, this all will go in a long way to help. I hope that you guys enjoyed and learned a lot. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you, everyone here.